Welcome to the Tim Booker channel, where the wisdom of virtue is shared. I wish you a pleasant listening experience. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a book called Why Therapy Works. This book is over 270 pages long and contains nearly 200,000 words. Its author, Louis Cozolino, is a psychology professor at Pepperdine University in the United States and is well known in the field of psychotherapy. Cozolino has previously written a book titled The Making of a Therapist, which is acclaimed as the best introductory guide for novice counselors. However, the book I'm discussing today is not about how to conduct counseling. It delves into the neural mechanisms behind psychotherapy and psychological counseling. So, why did Cozolino write such a book? It turns out he is not just a theoretical scholar but also a psychotherapist with nearly 40 years of experience. Psychotherapy goes a step further than psychological counseling. It focuses on patients with clear psychological disorders, not just ordinary people with negative emotions. Cozolino was well versed in psychotherapy, but one day, a serious businessman posed two challenging questions to him. The businessman straightforwardly asked, "How does this psychotherapy actually help people? Does it have any reliable scientific basis?" These questions surprised Cozolino because most psychotherapists tend to assume that their work is effective and are more concerned with improving treatment outcomes rather than understanding the underlying principles. This is akin to soldiers on a battlefield primarily thinking about how to win the battle rather than questioning the purpose of the battle itself. While there are many theoretical concepts within psychology to explain the effects of psychotherapy, some of these concepts may have a high cognitive threshold and remain confined within the discipline. This can lead to doubts about whether psychotherapy is just a set of elusive techniques aimed at mesmerizing people. At this point, Cozolino realized that to clarify the principles of psychotherapy, he needed to delve into our brains. He needed to explore how the brain reacts to external stimuli during its evolutionary journey and how it remembers the traumas experienced in life. Only by understanding these questions could he convince ordinary people that psychotherapy and psychological counseling are indeed valuable. Therefore, Cozolino spent 2 years writing this book in 2015. He didn't rely on too much jargon from psychology but, instead, used accessible knowledge from neuroscience and neurobiology to reveal the underlying mechanisms of psychotherapy in a straightforward manner. After reading this book, you will not only gain a better understanding of the causes of various emotional issues but also receive practical advice from Cozolino on how to address psychological problems. It's no wonder that the International Neuropsychological Society recommends that every clinical physician reads Cozolino's book. Next, I will introduce the main content of the book in 3 parts. First, we will explore why psychological problems arise in the evolutionary and developmental process of the human brain and how psychological disorders affect the brain. In the second part, I will explain the mechanisms through which psychotherapy helps the brain return to a healthy state. Finally, I will summarize the advice given by the author, Cozolino, for our daily psychological well-being. Not everyone in their lifetime will necessarily encounter psychological wounds, and many people may never need to step into a counseling room. However, we've all experienced moments when we face a psychological hurdle that seems insurmountable. This hurdle might be filled with pain, fear, or depression. So, what is the physiological mechanism behind this phenomenon? Author Cozolino tells us that it's related to the human brain. In our perception, the brain is a seamless, highly complex, and intricate machine. Facing a psychological hurdle is akin to a machine malfunction that requires immediate repair. But Cozolino suggests that this idea is incorrect. The brain is composed of 2 systems, fast and slow, which have evolved and merged over a long period. To illustrate, many people have experienced accidentally touching a scalding hot kettle while pouring boiling water. They instinctively pull back their hand, followed by a sense of fear. This process may appear seamless, but it can be divided into 2 separate stages. In the first stage, the hand or body is responsible for reacting, experiencing pain and generating fear due to physical discomfort. Only in the second stage does cognition come into play, where thoughts like, "Am I seriously injured? Should I apply first aid?" arise. By this point, the feeling of fear has gradually diminished. From this example, you can observe a slight time lag between the body's physical response and conscious thought. The body reacts faster, while conscious thought is slower. This is not just a casual conclusion, it is scientifically supported. Our brain processes sensory, motor, and emotional information the quickest, taking only 10 to 50 milliseconds. However, when it comes to conscious processing of information, involving the activation of more neurons and neural systems, it requires 500 to 600 milliseconds. There's approximately half a second of time difference between the two systems, known as the fast and slow systems in the brain. So, why does the same brain have two systems? The answer lies in human evolutionary history. Modern humans evolved from primates approximately 100,000 years ago. At that time, our brain structure was relatively simple, similar to the neural structure of mammals and reptiles, constituting the fast system. The fast system existed to fulfill basic survival needs, such as generating fear. While it has some negative aspects, it allows individuals and animals to respond immediately to threats. It took an additional 50,000 years for human brains to evolve into a more complex structure with logical, imaginative, and empathetic abilities. This layered system is the slow system. Interestingly, the fast system is not only the earliest to appear in human evolutionary history but also the first to develop in infants. This involves a significant brain region called the amygdala, closely related to emotional issues. When the amygdala is activated, we experience fear. Conversely, if a person's amygdala experiences dysfunction, they may be at risk of developing mental disorders such as anxiety, Alzheimer's disease, and autism. The amygdala region is already mature before birth. In other words, fetuses in their mother's womb already possess the fast system and can respond to negative information with fear. On the other hand, the slow system, which is conscious and capable of regulating extreme emotions, is unique to the brain's cortical network. The cortical network takes approximately 20 years or longer to fully mature, creating a time gap between the two systems. Now, you might be wondering, how do the fast and slow systems relate to psychological issues? Well, if you have some knowledge of psychology, you'll understand that psychological counseling and therapy place particular emphasis on a person's early experiences. For example, renowned psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud emphasized the influence of childhood experiences. Counselors often encourage clients to recall their childhood and relationships with their parents in an attempt to identify underlying factors causing distress. Why do psychological issues stem from a person's early experiences? According to Cozzolino, the problem arises from the time gap in the development of the fast and slow systems. During infancy and early childhood, the brain's cortex is not yet mature and cannot actively regulate emotions. At this stage, the amygdala in the fast system is active and is closely linked to external feedback, especially the feedback from primary caregivers. This is why a mother's role in an infant's psychological well-being is crucial. In the common perception, infants and toddlers are thought to have no psychological activity, simply eating and sleeping. However, this is a misconception. Infants and toddlers also undergo emotional changes, experiencing pain and discomfort. A sleeping child suddenly wakes up, possibly due to wetting the bed or feeling hungry, both of which lead to discomfort. A toddler who has just started walking may trip and fall, experiencing both pain and fear. In both scenarios, if the caregiver immediately responds to the child's needs and provides comfort, the child's amygdala receives positive feedback, stabilizing the child's emotional state. Conversely, if the caregiver fails to respond promptly or even shows frustration and irritation, the child's amygdala remains in a state of prolonged, uncontrollable high stimulation, potentially sowing the seeds of psychological issues. However, there's a complication here. According to Cozzolino, even when the slow system matures, it doesn't necessarily provide a solution to childhood psychological problems. First, the amygdala remains a central processing hub for social and emotional information throughout a person's life. Someone who experienced significant trauma or chronic stress during childhood directly influences the development of their brain. These individuals might have larger amygdalas. In a resting state, their cortisol, norepinephrine, and endorphin secretion levels are higher than those of the general population. These hormones significantly impact the brain's ability to process physiological, psychological, and social information, and they are not subject to the regulation of the slow system. In other words, the psychological trauma experienced during childhood can have long-lasting effects on the brain. Furthermore, the slow system, while more complex and advanced, does not respond to objective circumstances. When we encounter challenging situations and feel fear, our brain acts like a search engine. It subconsciously scans our memories, body, and emotions for relevant information. In terms of proportions, 90% of the neural information entering the brain's cortex comes from within. In other words, we make judgments and decisions based on existing experiences. So, if a person's existing experiences and perceptions are already problematic, they are susceptible to entering a vicious cycle of repeated mistakes. This is why there is a psychological theory called insecure attachment styles. These attachment styles manifest as people who yearn for intimacy but frequently engage in avoidance behavior when others try to get close to them. From a neuroscientific perspective, this phenomenon occurs when the danger signals contained within the amygdala are activated by intimate relationships. External stimuli awaken accumulated negative neural information, leading to a subsequent avoidance response. Additionally, research has shown that people who experience significant childhood trauma develop a stronger instinct for self-preservation, to the extent that it may become their primary life goal. In such cases, the brain's activity is entirely controlled by the amygdala, and the slow system is unable to provide regulatory support. Well, that's the neuroscientific basis behind the psychological issues analyzed by Cozzolino. You might be wondering, given that psychological problems arise from changes in brain functioning, how can psychotherapy be effective? Can simply talking to a therapist really solve these issues? Cozzolino provides an explanation. He says that psychotherapy works because the brain's neural networks are plastic. The fundamental units of the nervous system are neurons, and they can generate, grow, and develop. They connect with each other through structures called synapses. The synaptic structure in the brain is not static. With the right environment and stimuli, neurons release different neurotransmitters, affecting the strength and quantity of synapses and, consequently, establishing new connections. This process is the fundamental principle of all human learning activities. As neural connections change, the balance of power between the brain's fast and slow systems can also shift. Cozzolino offers an impressive example in his book. In medicine, there is a term called the grasping reflex. It refers to how infants often tightly grip objects in their early 2 to 3 months of life. If you allow a baby to hold your finger during this time, you'll notice that their grip is strong enough for you to lift them with just one finger. This grasping reflex is controlled by the brainstem and is a vestige of human evolution. We often see infant primates, like baby chimpanzees, clinging tightly to their mother's fur and following them around in zoos, which is the prototype of the grasping reflex. This behavior is essential for these animals in the wild to be able to move flexibly and survive. However, infants lose the grasping reflex after the first 2 to 3 months of life. This isn't because the brainstem's instinct disappears, but because the brain cortex gradually begins to develop. It sends down fibers to inhibit the brainstem's grasping reflex. After all, if a person were forever controlled by brainstem instinct, they would only perform the grasping action and would never free their hands for more complex tasks. This change is also a product of evolution. Interestingly, when an individual gets older and starts experiencing memory loss symptoms, neurologists often perform a specific test. They ask the patient to extend both arms with palms facing downward. The doctor then runs their fingers along the patient's arms from the elbow to the hand, stimulating the palm. If the patient exhibits the grasping reflex at this point, it indicates that there's an issue with the neurons of the frontal and parietal lobes. The brain cortex is deteriorating, and the brainstem and its underlying instincts are regaining dominance. The grasping reflex is a vivid example demonstrating that the relationship between the slow and fast systems can change under certain conditions. As the brain cortex establishes new neural connections and inhibits overactive amygdalae, an individual's behaviors and responses to the outside world also undergo changes. Psychotherapy, in essence, functions by stimulating a person's slow system to induce the brain cortex to create new neural connections. How is this stimulation achieved? Cozzolino explains it in 2 levels. The first level is establishing new interpersonal relationships. We often say that the most important aspect of choosing a therapist is having a strong therapeutic alliance. Even if a therapist has a great reputation, the therapeutic process won't work well if there's a lack of trust. From this perspective, undergoing psychological counseling and therapy is an attempt to establish a new, positive interpersonal relationship. Interpersonal relationships are important because humans are fundamentally social beings, and the human brain is a social brain. For the human brain, the so-called reality is largely based on social interactions and the reconstruction of information from the outside world. When something is visible to others, it appears more real. Therefore, we often notice that when children try new things, they continuously ask their parents to watch them and say, "Mom, watch me," or "Dad, watch me." We need to see ourselves through the eyes of others to construct our self-awareness. When a person is facing a therapist, they are creating an opportunity to return to a childlike state and undergo psychological experiences anew. The second key tool for the effectiveness of psychotherapy is storytelling. In the therapy room, the most crucial thing a client does is tell their story. Stories are valuable because they involve language and memory, both of which activate the brain's cortex. Therapists encourage clients to articulate their past emotional experiences and feelings completely. During this process, the storyteller also observes the reactions of the listener. Through these reactions, they can reevaluate the emotional significance of their past experiences. Moreover, the act of storytelling is a process of generating new memories. In reality, the therapist is accompanying the client back to the root of their suffering and guiding them through the complete journey from emotional turmoil to balance. Every time the client faces fear and self-doubt and worries that the therapist will criticize, ridicule, or abandon them, if the therapist provides a positive and encouraging response, new, more positive memory is created. The next time they encounter negative events, the memories retrieved by the brain won't be exclusively distant pain, and their responses will be more diverse, moving further away from a vicious cycle. Through these two levels of interpersonal relationships and storytelling, psychotherapists can stimulate the client's brain cortex, prompting it to create new neural connections. As the brain cortex becomes more activated, the client won't immediately succumb to the fast system when they experience fear and stress. Instead, they'll employ the slow system to resist and balance. Over time, the client can gradually develop healthier and more complete emotional regulation capabilities. So, talk therapy is far from just casual conversation, it's rooted in a set of neuroscientific principles. Alright, that's the neuroscientific mechanism behind psychotherapy that Cozzolino introduced. After understanding all of this, you must be wondering how to apply it. Cozzolino offers 3 practical pieces of advice, especially for individuals who haven't undergone professional psychotherapy. The first piece of advice is to learn to activate your brain cortex. As mentioned earlier, to keep emotions in a healthy balance, it's necessary to let the brain cortex's power suppress the amygdala and control the fast system with the slow system. Activating the brain cortex can be achieved through the power of psychotherapy and psychological counseling, but you can also actively train it in your daily life. Many people have experienced moments when they suddenly feel fear or anger, seemingly without a clear reason. When you find yourself in such a situation, it's an excellent opportunity to practice self-awareness. Cozzolino provides an example. Clinical physicians in the United States helping alcoholics recover use a HOT training. HALT stands for hunger, anger, loneliness, and tiredness, representing the initial letters of these 4 English words. This training involves having the alcoholic pause when they feel the urge to take a drink, asking themselves, what's causing my desire to drink? Is it hunger, anger, loneliness, tiredness, or some other negative emotion? Are there alternative ways to deal with these emotions besides drowning them with alcohol? When the alcoholic develops the habit of self-questioning and gains insight into the emotional triggers behind their drinking behavior, they can find healthier ways to cope with stress rather than reflexively turning to alcohol. Cozzolino suggests that when we find ourselves in fear and anger, we can also try to question ourselves. What's the root cause of these emotions? Do I have any means to dissipate them? This kind of self-questioning is a fundamental form of personal training. However, it's important to avoid pitfalls, especially those that reinforce inherent biases. Cozzolino observes that people often engage in negative internal dialogues that largely stem from fear, shame, and doubt within. These dialogues lead to self-criticism and, if one continually engages in such self-deprecating thought patterns, it erodes their self-confidence, perpetuating a vicious cycle. How can you break free from self-deprecation? Cozzolino's advice is to build your own narrative. As mentioned earlier, psychotherapy involves guided storytelling with a therapist, while personal storytelling involves proactively organizing and reviewing your own experiences to share with others. Initially, you might create a timeline of events, outlining what happened in different years, for instance. Then, you can ask yourself some questions, like, if I had made different choices at a certain point in time, would I be more successful or happier? Did I give up on my dreams due to fear of disapproval from my family, and would they truly have disapproved? Cozzolino explains that the process of constructing narratives helps liberate the self from the story. It's like taking off an old shirt, mending its tears, and putting it back on. While creating narratives, the frontal lobe's functions in the brain become further activated, while amygdala activity decreases, and anxiety and fear correspondingly reduce. If you find it awkward to share your stories with others, you can also try writing about your experiences in a journal. The effect is similar. When we have the ability to examine our narratives, establish new self-assessments and understandings, we gain the capacity to change our lives. Cozzolino's second piece of advice is to learn to be angry. He discovered that many people suffer because they tend to take on the role of submissives in their social relationships. This role can lead to two extremes. On one hand, some individuals exhibit a form of hysterical eruption where they project their violence onto those closest to them, such as their partners and children. On the other hand, some develop a reflexive fear, losing the ability to feel anger. How does the loss of anger occur? This brings us back to the amygdala. The brain processes the pattern of the submissive psychological role, much like traumatic experiences, and it's predominantly controlled by the amygdala. When submissives encounter their leaders, they form a memory that if they show confidence, anger, or dissatisfaction, it will provoke the leader and result in irreversible consequences. In this scenario, the amygdala equates anger with danger and fear, developing it into a conditioned reflex. To protect the submissive from danger, the amygdala directly suppresses the emotion of anger. Consequently, this weakens the brain cortex's regulatory capacity, leading to emotional disorders. Cozzolino once encountered a visitor named Sandy during his psychotherapy practice, who was struggling with emotional issues. Sandy, a talented engineer, had been playing the role of a submissive in both his work and family life for over a decade. However, after enduring this obedient lifestyle for so long, he realized he could no longer function normally. When clients asked him to present his new inventions, he would avoid it out of fear of failure and confrontation. His marriage was also on the brink of falling apart due to the burden. Cozzolino found that Sandy's patterns of social interaction were heavily influenced by his original family environment. His father was adept at physical and emotional abuse, which was the source of Sandy's childhood fears. In contrast, his mother was a quiet, loyal person who would rather swallow her grievances to maintain family unity. Sandy identified with his mother and adopted her habit of avoiding conflicts when facing them. In the end, he became a desperate submissive. Cozzolino's initial advice to Sandy was to experience the feeling of anger. He asked Sandy to imagine a scenario. One day, he was out with his daughter, and suddenly, a person came to abduct her. How would he react? Initially, Sandy felt scared, tears welled up in his eyes. But then, his paternal instincts took over. He began to roar, saying that he wouldn't let anyone take his daughter as long as he had breath, and he'd even go so far as to bite the kidnapper's neck to save her. At this point, Cozzolino interjected, telling Sandy that while he had been accustomed to the submissive role in the past and had set himself up as a coward, that was never the true and complete version of himself. He needed to embrace the feeling of anger in the present moment, harness its power, and prevent fear from overwhelming him. After addressing the emotion of anger, Cozzolino offered a third piece of advice: confronting fear. These 4 words might sound simple, but they are rooted in a set of neuroscientific principles. As mentioned earlier, fear is predominantly controlled by the amygdala, and it inhibits the higher cognitive abilities of the brain cortex, preventing us from analyzing and solving problems further. The amygdala corresponds to the brain's instinct to prioritize survival. When we become accustomed to avoiding fear and remain unwilling to face new situations and challenges, the amygdala strengthens its survival-centric strategy, even vetoing happiness for the sake of survival. Facing fear is meant to retrain your amygdala and sympathetic nervous system, preventing them from rapidly firing up at the slightest encounter with unfamiliar environments and making the nervous system the sole ruler. This process, of course, isn't easy. However, if it enables us to discover more possibilities in life and experience greater happiness, it's worth the effort. So, that's the main content of the book, Why Psychotherapy Works, by Cozzolino. I hope this book has given you a deeper understanding of the neuroscientific mechanisms behind psychological issues and has encouraged you to face your own inner demons with greater awareness and courage. We all seek to minimize suffering in our lives, and that's one of the reasons we turn to psychology for help. However, there's a thought-provoking passage in Cozzolino's book that left a lasting impression on me. He said that suffering is inseparable from life, desires lead to disappointments, love makes you experience loss, and life, from the moment of birth, inexorably marches towards aging and death. Cozzolino thus suggests that our pursuit should not be to avoid suffering but to minimize torment. Torment arises from the anxiety of expecting that you won't get what you desire or fearing the loss of what you already have. It's a form of anticipatory anxiety. When we're trapped in torment, regardless of how much we already possess, it will never be enough, and we drift further from happiness. Someone who anticipates happiness should consciously train their slow system to build a robust regulatory ability and be vigilant about the emergence of torment emotions. This is because your happiness largely depends on you. That concludes the essence of this book. Congratulations on finishing another book. Thank you for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker Channel audiobook channel. Give it a thumbs up and share it with your family and friends. Wisdom is worth spreading, and it can help create a brighter future. Thank you, and goodbye.